Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome to Midweek through a Scottish Prism. Great to see you again. I hope you and yours are well. Got a good favourite of the show on today, and with things happening at a flurry in Ukraine, we thought it was appropriate to bring back Finbar Markey to have a wee chat with us about it. Finbar, welcome
Hello,
back
Scotland and beyond. Hello, Scotland and beyond. How are you? I'm going to miss Lloyd. Normally we have Lloyd on as well, and he's such a great contributor. And so I'm going to miss him today, but we'll try to do our best without him. It won't be as good without Lloyd.
Oh, well, that's true, but we look forward to getting him back soon. And how have you been? Have you been following things quite closely over in Ukraine?
There's so much to follow at this stage, right around the globe. So many conflict zones, so much death, so much war. A little bit of hope over the last few weeks with Donald Trump coming in terms of Europe. But in terms of the Middle East, Trump's inauguration does not bode well, I think, for any Arab nationalists or anybody who wants true independence and sovereignty in Arab states, especially the Palestinian people. But in terms of Europe, yeah, definitely some positive changes, and I think we'll be discussing that today.
Yeah, I mean, he when he made the announcement, it wasn't so much out of the blue, because I mean, he had been saying in his campaign he would stop at day one, etc., etc. But when he did make his announcement, it seemed to really throw the Democrats in America, the Liberals, the EU, the European countries, the UK, France, they all have been going tonto ever since.
Yeah, I had my doubts even about Trump's commitments to stopping the Ukraine war prior to his inauguration, because a lot of people do a lot of talking, politicians, and we're not used to the Trump-type politicians. Now, Trump, on the one hand, I think it's very notable that he's pointing the blame for the Ukrainian war at every nation state except the United States. He's right that the war has to stop. He's right that the Ukrainians and Zelensky has a major questions to ask in terms of their behaviors throughout this conflict. But in terms of who started this war, we all know it was US foreign policy. It's long-term policy to destabilize Russia, to break Russia up. It hasn't worked for them. I think I'd like to see Donald Trump blaming the Biden administration more, but he can't really do that because much of the build-up was on his watch. Prior to the beginning of the special military operation, as the Russians called it, when 90,000 troops went over the border. So a lot of that was on his watch too. It hasn't gone well for them. So it's easy for Trump to point the finger and to blame everybody else. But ultimately, as the president of the United States, he has to take responsibility for the activities and the actions of his country at an international level, on the international stage, even if he wasn't in the presidency for some of that. I think it's important at some point that it's recognized that Trump and his administration are not complete innocents in this as well.
Oh, for sure they're not innocents. It's very much a US-NATO proxy war. But the point is, America's done what America always does, is they've abandoned their allies when their own interests change. And they've not only thrown Ukraine under the bus, so to speak, they've done the same to all the other NATO countries, especially the Baltic states, the UK, France, and Germany.
Well, if you remember Henry Kissinger's much quoted phrase, to be a friend of America is dangerous. Sorry, to be an enemy of America is dangerous. To be a friend of America is fatal. And that's coming from the guy that led American foreign policy when he was in office and out of office throughout the 1970s and 80s and the late 1960s as well, and a lot of the 80s, So I think that's taken for granted now, that when you play with the devil, you're going to get burned either way, whether you're friend or foe to the devil himself. But ultimately, it's positive. There's changes coming. Unfortunately, a lot of the European leaders can't see it. In fact, they're rebelling against it. And I think that's going to be a key topic of discussion in this show today, the response of EU leaders and the UK leaders.
Indeed, as you can see here, our Sir Keir Starmer, the kid starver as he's called, among other things, he's 3 years on from Putin's barbaric full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There'll be a bit of verbosity there. We will stand with you today and always. I don't think our Keir is reading the room, is he?
I don't think so, but he doesn't care about the room. I think his perception of his role is, I'm in here for 4 years. I'm not going to be re-elected. I'm going to do the task set by my paymasters, whoever they may be, whether those paymasters are bribing him, blackmailing him, whatever they're doing. But nobody with an ounce of empathy, with an ounce of humanity, would want this war to continue. And certainly no prime minister should be committing their citizens and their young men and women to go and die in a war that is long lost. And it was lost before it began.
Yeah, I mean, the EU could find itself really isolated very soon, with Russia, America, Ukraine as the main people, and the whole of the global south wanting peace, and the EU alone with the UK being the only nations that want to continue the killing and the war. They really could isolate themselves. They're not doing themselves any favours.
Yeah. They have a terrible habit, this particular clique of European leadership. And remember, the European Union, in terms of leadership, en general, there's a few countries that might differ, but in general, that leadership is more than just individual leaders of countries within the EU making up their own minds and decisions independently and then presenting them to them a table in Brussels. What has actually happened over the last 10 to 15 years is a new mechanism and structure of leadership was created in Europe, in which they sing all off the same hymn sheet, and they all seem to have the same paymasters and present themselves as being of the same mindset. And yet, to my mind, it's an organized, orchestrated clique. When we look at what the opposition to these groupings, these presidents and these prime ministers across Europe, when we look at their own countries and the opposition, the polling that happens in those countries, opposition to particular policies, we see that they are very much separate from their people in terms of their opinions on these things. So Germany, for instance, had elections there on Sunday. New guy, Merz, got in. He got in only in a coalition. This Merz guy is even more pro-war than Scholz was. For instance, Merz wanted to give Ukraine permission to fire tourist missiles, which would involve German military personnel, to fire tourist missiles deep into Russia. Scholz has said no. This new Merz guy has been very pro-tourist missiles and very pro-war in Ukraine, far more than Scholz. But he could only get into that position through a coalition. There was nobody outright won the German elections. And I won't be surprised to see more elections in Germany within in the next year or 2 years as crisis builds. But we have that clique in placed in office in France, in the UK, in Germany, in Holland, and in other countries that are very, very much pro-war. We think that they will be changed because of elections. People were talking about there'll be massive change in Germany with the AfD. That has not happened. Macron has basically ignored the results of the last elections and has insisted on forming a government that is not the government that's wanted by the people in France. So he's holding on. How long will he hold on until he can get a replacement that is a mirror image of himself? In the UK, you've got Starmer, who knows he's in for the next 4 years. I'm afraid of the severe damage that Starmer will do because he knows he's not getting back in, and he is only working in the interest of some hidden cabal that's directing him. So in terms of that separatism, that isolationism that's happening within Europe, I don't see it's stopping over the next while. In fact, if you look at Macron and other people, up until this morning, Macron has been doubling down. For the first time, Macron has agreed that peace negotiations should happen and should happen soon. And the only reason he's saying that is because it's happening without him anyway, and they want to be a part of that. But I can see Trump pulling them in a little bit. Trump doesn't want American troops in Ukraine in any format, peacekeepers or anything else. The Europeans and the British, they're offering peacekeepers. Ireland is offering peacekeepers, into a zone in which the conflict is not resolved, into a zone in which, when we took a look at the last 2 Minsk agreements that were secured and guaranteed by Germany and France, Germany and France actively worked against those agreements. So Putin has already said he will not have any faith or trust in EU peacekeepers in Ukraine in any format whatsoever. This morning, the European leaders are pushing for that. And Donald Trump has made statements himself about the Europeans involved as peacekeepers in there. So And there is little elements of agreement between the Europeans and Donald Trump in terms of peacekeepers and things like that. We don't know what the Russians are thinking, other than their statements that they made prior to the peace talks, in which they were clear: no peacekeepers from the EU.
They've made some more comments today, and one of them is quite simple. Lavrov himself said there is no way any NATO troops are going to be in a peacekeeping force. Just not going to happen. But here's the Russians are setting conditions, and they've got red lines that they're going. One of them is, as I say, any NATO troops, Western Europe troops, and just not on. Probably Irish troops would probably be fine. And it's got to be a long-term. It's got to be a long-term solution. There's to be, there's not going to be something that will allow them to lick their wounds and come back at Russia. Russia wants their security taken into consideration. And the truth is, whether our media admit it or not, or whether our politicians admit it or not, Finbar, but the West has very little leverage in this. The Russians have most, if not all, of the leverage as the winning proponents in this war.
I think in terms of leverage, yesterday there was a new sanctions package against Russia announced by the EU, the 16th sanctions package, which involved only a couple of companies and individuals. But at that announcement of that sanction package, they announced that they were working on a 17th sanctions package. When will they cop on? Sanctions have not only not worked, they've backfired, because they've forced Russia to become independent. They've forced Russia to cut off those ties that actually confined them and constrained them in the past. So from an economic point of view, you're right, they have nothing. From a military point of view, they've already given their backstock of weapons to the Ukrainians. They have nothing left. The British Army is in a more precarious position in terms of being able to defend Britain now than it has been since the Boer War, if not before it. Their armaments are depleted. So a lot of their big equipment is becoming obsolete. It's old-fashioned, and some of it's in disrepair. We saw ships being sent back from the Red Sea that was sent in this project Prosperity Garden, or whatever it was called. This sending of ships from the US fleet, from the British fleet, from the French fleet, etc., into the Red Sea to stop the Yemenis who were stopping shipping getting into Israel. The British had to send one of their main cruisers back to Britain for repairs, because I won't say it's falling apart, that would be an exaggeration, but it's not in operable condition. So the idea that the Europeans or the British or them combined have any capacity to challenge Russia, and bear in mind, when the SMO, the special military operation where the Russians crossed the border into Ukraine, when that started, the Russians started that with 90,000 troops. It was not an invasion. It was a military operation to stop the bombing of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. Since then, they've poured lots more troops in, lots more equipment in. They've multiplied their capacity to produce massively. I saw some figures there where Russia in a year can produce as many weapons as Britain, the US, and Europe can in the space of a month, something like that. It was ridiculous statistics. Maybe it was 3 months, but it was something outrageously disproportionate like that. But actually a fact, So they don't have anything. And it's all bluster as far as I can see. Trump loves his bluster anyway, but the Europeans are full of bluster, because you said earlier, as an example, about maybe the Irish could send peacekeepers because they're not in NATO. Ireland practically is in NATO. NATO monitors our army on an annual basis and monitors our equipment, stuff like that. We participate in certain particular types of NATO exercises. We are involved in PESCO, the European Army project. We are very much a part of NATO. The Irish politicians, governing politicians, since the outbreak of the SMO was developed into a war, they have been hellishly vociferous against Russia and have engaged in the hyperbole and the pure bullshit propaganda that has been spread about this war from day one. As a result, I don't think the Russians would see the Irish as an appropriate contributor to any type of a peacekeeping agreement in Ukraine either. But just going back to your point about what do the Europeans and what do the British have to play with in this game of life and death, and they have nothing to play with. The only thing they have to play with is some kind of a change of heart, where Britain gets rid of Keir Starmer, somebody is brought in that hasn't called Putin every name under the sun, that hasn't participated in the pro-war vitriol that's been going on for the last nearly into 4 years, and that they start negotiating with a genuine peace. The Americans were able to go with a change of leadership from the most pro-war, antagonistic element within Ukraine overnight to becoming the peacemakers in Ukraine. And that only took a visible, obvious change of leadership. And I think until that happens in the EU, until that happens in Britain, this war is not going to be settled in a manner that the Europeans and the British think is appropriate.
Yep. The problem is in the UK that they're all so pro-Ukrainian. They're all anti-Russian, all the parties, all the leaders. So you can't, you replace them, you're just going to get another one. Even the Scottish National Party. And I did notice Michelle O'Neill as well over Northern Ireland, showing support for and empathy for Ukraine. So it seems that all the British political parties are captured in this Russia-phobic insanity.
Yeah, but a part of that, I think, is a lack of a backbone. A lot of them will see things on Twitter. They'll have their inner working model of what's happening. They'll have that questioned by information that comes in front of them, literally on screen, and they ignore it because ultimately they don't have the backbone to stand in a parliament or stand in Dáil Éireann or stand in a synod or wherever it might be and actually speak the truth, because they know they'll be lambasted left, right and centre. They'll be lambasted by the corporate media as well. So rather than facing the winds of change, because the winds of change can be quite harsh at the beginning to people who want to bring that change and will try to blow them over. But it takes real people with spine and with backbone. And unfortunately, our political classes and clique, whether it's Ireland, the UK, or Scotland, I should say individually, or whether it's in the EU, they just don't have that. The heroism that is needed to be able to speak the truth in a room full of haters is not present within the European Parliament, within Scottish parliaments, within Irish parliaments.
Well, I don't know, Mick Wallace did all right, he does all right, and Claire before him, when she was there, they spoke out against this war.
And look what happened to Claire.
Yeah, indeed, I'm surprised the Irish people did that to her.
Yeah.
Anyway, there is a new détente, and again, the European leaders are not paying attention, because the Europe, I don't know if you know this, yesterday I think it was, the UN, there was a European resolution condemning Russia's special military operation. And that not only did the Russians veto it, the Americans vetoed it as well.
Yeah.
Now, guys, if the NATO partners can't go back to our first state, to be a friend is fatal.
Yeah.
If they can't see that they're not a reliable ally, the US.
Again, such fundamental change. I remember watching Samantha Power as the UN rep for the United States. This is the one that now is made in charge of US aid. She likes to harp on about her Irish roots and all this kind of jazz. To me, she's an embarrassment to the Irish nation that's fought for sovereignty and independence for so long when you look at what she's advocating in other countries. But when I look at the performance of the likes of Power in the UN Council not very long ago, and we look at that fundamental change in that vote, it's ground shaking. It really is in terms of where the US stands and the balance of power in the world and in the UN itself. It's not going to go well for Palestine, I know that, but in terms of the Ukrainian issue, even within the UN, that at 180-degree change in attitude by the US is so obvious, and I have to say I'm thankful to see it, and I would love to see that change slowly permeate into other issues like the Palestinian issue.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've noticed since both the Ukraine war and the Palestine genocide is the blatant dishonesty, not just by our politicians, but by our media and a lot of the pundits. I mean, the lies have been quite incredible. And there was this week on BBC Two Newsnight, a posh voice, so that gives it credibility in the UK in our feudal system. Sir Alex Younger, who was the ex-MI6 chief for 5 years. And he was talking about how, well, Trump's got so much leverage because the Russian economy is teetering on the brink of collapse. They've lost 1 million soldiers at the front. They're having terrible losses. And so, President Trump has got lots of leverage. And I'm sitting going, I know everything he's just said is a lie. But it's gone out, and of course the interviewer is not going to pull him up. it's been quite disgusting, the lies in this whole thing.
But if you look, I recall back to the first 6 months of the year, Ursula von der Leyen, who has just committed hundreds of billions of EU money, by the way, yesterday at a meeting in Kiev. Ursula von der Leyen telling stories such as an example, that Russian soldiers are now stealing refrigerators from Ukrainian homes because they lack any kind of parts for their military hardware, and they have to steal fridges. I remember Zelensky's wife talking about an old lady who threw a jar of pickles, I think it was, at a fighter jet and downed the fighter jet. The most outrageous, ridiculous, ludicrous lies you can imagine that got repeated right around the world, and that became the inner working model of the politicians in Europe who believed all this kind of jazz. How can they now go back and say, sorry, yeah, we were kind of wrong about all that? It's just, they got to go. It's not a case they have to change. They got to go, because the amount of lies they told, there's no way you could. Well, they have hard necks and they have the cheek to try to hold on and persist, because that's what they are. They're, as far as I'm concerned, they're chancers. They've been chancers from the day they were born, most of them.
Oh, I think Goebbels would be embarrassed at the brass neck of some of these. I mean, they really do kick the bum out of it. But what came through, of course, the US aid, that again, President Trump has absolutely put his dog into and run amok through it. And we find out that the entire media in Ukraine was being funded by US aid. Even the BBC were getting money. And God knows how many other publications. The Spectator was one. How many other publications throughout Western Europe were getting bribed, let's be honest, to put out the American message. Is it any wonder we got all these lies?
Yeah, I remember less than a year into the war in Ukraine, I think Boris Johnson made an announcement. I won't 100% on that, but I do know that the British government did make an announcement that there was funds being allocated to the media in Britain to support Ukraine in this war. So maybe some of that funding was US aid funding, maybe US aid funding was additional to that. But I think the COVID narrative created a mechanism within the West, if you want to call it that, within Europe and within the United States. It created a mechanism to control the media. And that mechanism was not broken down after COVID. It has remained there, a mechanism of financing the media by the state on particular issues and causes. And that mechanism was established in its strength during the COVID crisis and remains there to this day. And there's no embarrassment now about ring fencing funding for causes within our media and even within our news reporting. I think the US aid news in relation to Ukrainian media, tip of the iceberg. I think what we'll find over the next few months is every news company, a corporate or state news company, receive funding in one way or another from US aid or from the Endowment for Democracy or one of those CIA money laundering fronts that exists. So doesn't surprise me whatsoever, but does allow us as commentators and critiques to be able to finally present the evidence of what we always intuitively knew. But now we have the evidence and the facts that that's exactly what's been happening.
Yeah. I mean, you say it goes back to COVID when they started. Well, here in Scotland, shall I say, they started it with us in 1922 when you were naughty boys across the water. They decided we shouldn't get the true information that's going on. We might be the same.
But creating those structures and those mechanisms to do it in a modern world, I think COVID was a major part of having the reasoning and the excuse to make it that it's not a covert anymore, that they're overtly doing it now.
Yeah, there's no one more sneaky, sleek than the Brits. Let's be honest. You don't have the largest empire the world's ever seen without being sneaky and sleek it.
I find that the British are. When I heard about the Nord Stream pipeline, for instance, bombing, straight away, to my mind, the Brits were involved in that, because anything that sounds James Bondi-ish, you're guaranteed that the Brits will be stupid ideas, outrageous ideas that sound like they're full of adventure. That's the kind of thing that you'll find the British have been involved in right around the world.
Yeah, well, I do believe actually that it was British planners who told them about Kursk, that they should go and invade Kursk. I believe they'd been reading the book about Arnhem and Market Garden, and then they told the Ukrainians, we've got a great idea here. Yeah. Head into Kursk, and that, as you know, you keep a close eye on it, has turned into an absolute killing
Yeah.
field for the poor Ukrainians.
A mess, an absolute mess. And then, the people that are sitting down planning these ridiculous ideas, they just have no empathy towards the life that is being lost. They're just little pieces on a chessboard that can be lost. They'll never know their names. They'll never know their mothers and fathers. They'll never see the tears of family or friends. As far as they're concerned, this is about the great game. The great game.
Yeah, I mean, what we're hearing, I'm seeing and reading, and from everything I can pick up from the non-Western media, but it too, sadly, they figure it could take 6 months for this peace treaty to be agreed. Now, I'm also reading, I don't know about you, Finbar, you can confirm or deny it, but there's like 1,000 casualties a day I'm hearing in the front. Now, it doesn't take a mathematician to work out if it's 6 months, that's a lot of casualties.
The Russians have a policy that when they're in negotiations, they don't do ceasefires. It's been their experience that while they engage in honesty in a ceasefire, the other side, in this case the Russians, the Ukrainians with the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, are working against them and are in breach of the ceasefire. So they know not to engage in ceasefires while negotiations are going on, because ceasefires will be used to their disadvantage quite often. The sooner this comes to an end, the better. This should have been talked about years ago. Trump, as much as there's many aspects that I don't like him, he said it. He said, you've been there for 3 years, Biden's administration. Not once have you tried to have a proper peace process. And now you're critiquing me for doing that. So the sooner the better. 6 months is a long time. It's going to be a lot of deaths. Hopefully it won't be 6 months. Hopefully something. But here's one of the issues. We talk about what the Ukrainians are giving or losing, or what the Americans are willing to give. What are the Russians willing to give? Because within any negotiation, there has to be some element of give and take. And a good question is, what are the Russians prepared to give in these negotiations? Are they going to be prepared to secede land? Are they going to be prepared to give something else, whether it's undoing the elections that occurred and certain areas becoming independent provinces? As most people don't understand that when the breakaway happened, when the Eastern Ukrainians, the Russians in Eastern Ukraine, when they had a vote on independence, their vote wasn't originally to join Russia. Their vote originally was to be an independent province within Ukraine, and that was agreed on as a part of Minsk and things like that. So maybe there'll be elements of certain regions in which the Russians might give a little bit there. I don't know, but it is an interesting question about what are the Russians going to give up in these negotiations.
Now, the thing is, what have they got to give up? Rumours, as we know, Donald Trump's a deal maker. He's not a professional politician. It's all about making deals. And one of the things they're saying is that they're all talking about the earth minerals that America craves, and has trying to get Zelensky to sign a deal for 500 billion payback. But they're now in Russian hands. And some of the things they're saying is that the Russians say, well, we'll give you some access to that. That could be what they're going to cede. I don't see them ceding any ground that they view as Russia or Novorossiya.
I'm not saying I see it happening, but in terms of putting everything on the table, possible gives to the American and Ukrainian side. If you can take one off the table and say, no, that's not. But just in terms of what is it that the Americans will expect, at the least, at a minimum, from the Russians. There's bigger things to these negotiations as well, like on the sidelines. And you may recall that Russia numerous times called for a proper global security agreement to be developed. And he was asking for that before the special military operation, during the special military operation. And I still think today that's a key aspect. Remember, over the last year in particular, nuclear protocols between the nations have been thrown out the window in terms of willingness to cooperate and trust amongst the nations in terms of nuclear weapons protocols. So that needs to be renegotiated again. And that might be another outcome of this. So I've got a feeling that Trump, who's an egotist ultimately, Trump will want to be the hero of the world. So I've got a feeling he will engage with Putin on those wider security issues and make them a part of an agreement based on ending the Ukrainian war.
Yeah, some people are criticising because he can't resist a camera, and he's almost given away his negotiating position before he goes in. And of course, the Russians are the exact opposite, stony-faced, saying nothing. Has he given away too much information, do you think, before these talks get underway properly?
One of the things that I think is most refreshing about Donald Trump is he can't keep his mouth shut. So, as an example, he was at a meeting with the Defense Department in the Pentagon in relation to Syria when he was in his last presidency. And when he came out of the meeting, nearly the first thing he said to the press there was, "Don't worry, we got the oil, we got the oil." So almost offensively honest that we knew on his mind exactly what he was in that meeting for. It was about the oil in Syria. Everybody else for decades was saying, "No, Syria is about democracy and freedom and this, that." And he came in straight away, "It's about the oil." So having that big mouth, it's actually refreshingly honest, right? In terms of, my perception of Trump is that, that book, The Art of the Deal, he still talks about that. And he openly says that what he'll do is he'll bombard you with threats and that at the beginning to force you into a knee-jerk reaction to agree with something. Well, you've told us that. You've written a book about that, an entire book about that, Donald. You keep on saying that that's what you do. So ultimately, I think him and his people know that they'll have to do serious negotiations on this, that it's not about this bumping people into a corner. You can't bump the Russians into a corner.
No.
That they're going to sit down in their committees, they're going to talk things out, they're going to listen to people that they don't even like to establish the lay of the land and what they're going to do. So I think Trump's honesty is refreshing. I think ultimately, I think the Russians are very honest too. I think Putin's very honest. Putin hasn't changed his position or the Russian position in the last 3 years, in the last 10 years on Ukraine. So he is honest. And when I listen to people who've worked with Russia in diplomacy, so worked on behalf of the United States in diplomacy with the Russians, and also in defense with the Russians over the last 34, and even people who've worked in the Soviet Union times, they'll all tell you that if the Russians made a commitment to something, you can believe them, and that they are honest, and they stick to their agreements. And this is a repeated by respected diplomats and people in international security over the years, the respected ones, not the crazies, but the respected ones, persistently and consistently say that you can trust the Russians, that they're not people who operate behind the counter, that they'll be upfront in what their expectations are, and if you don't meet them, well, they'll be honest and they'll say, "No, we don't agree." So I think from that point of view, Trump and Putin, their honesty with the public, their own public, and with the international public, I think will be a good match. They'll be left behind closed doors.
Yeah, but I think if I was Taiwan, I'd be paying attention to what's happening here and having a wee bit of change of a policy.
Well, I'm expecting that the US aid money to Taiwan has reduced significantly, I expect.
Well, I would think so, but they love to cut and run and still claim a victory. And Taiwan, be aware, that's exactly what will happen to you. Moving on slightly from that, do you see NATO surviving this?
I do, but not in its current form. Not in a form in which NATO is basically a tool of the United States at the moment, and what you might call neo-Atlanticists within Europe and Britain. So these are people who vehemently support and insist on the dominance of the United States within Europe and within the United States, within the wider global sphere. I think that the Atlanticists have been so anti-Russian and so pro-Ukrainian and have been proven to be so wrong in everything that they've done and said over the last few years. I think their position is weakening, and they want to retain a NATO as it exists at the moment. There's no doubt about that. And they want to actually expand NATO. I can see NATO getting smaller. I can see some of the Central and Eastern European countries that are in NATO having a serious conversation amongst themselves about the advantages and disadvantages of being in a NATO in which it lost to Russia. And that's ultimately what's happening. Russia has won this. It'll be couched in a different way. As an example, you spoke about the UN resolution that was put down by Ukraine yesterday, in which the Americans and the Russians both basically rejected it by not voting on it. That instance is, I think that cooperation is going to expand. I read it somewhere this morning that the Americans and the Russians are working on new wording that will ensure that Russia is not to blame within the wording of a new resolution on Ukraine. So that's changing too. So it's all change. I think at the end, NATO will be much reduced. The EU does, like, for instance, it's a massive campaign in Ireland over the last few weeks, over the last few years. But since Trump took power, the campaign to get Ireland to invest in a military-industrial complex, the campaign to get Ireland to abandon its triple lock system in terms of our neutrality, attempts to get us to join military alliances around the world have ramped up to such a degree that it's almost like someone pressed a button somewhere. All of the corporate media, all of the corporate politicians have suddenly started pushing this like their life depends on it. And we in Ireland have been told that Russia might invade Ireland. That's what we have been told. Russia is a threat to Ireland. A threat to Ireland. And the Irish people are not buying it. We used to have a thing called a citizens' assembly in Ireland, which itself I thought was wishy-washy, to establish the opinions of the Irish people so that things can be brought to referendum where appropriate. The government bypassed that last year, and they had their own research information sessions with the public, which many people said they were rigged. Even though they were rigged, and even though it was designed to try to garner support for NATO, the report from those sessions came out and said that there is no appetite amongst the Irish public to get rid of triple lock or to abandon our neutrality in any way. So even the government's own exercise at creating propaganda to be pro-NATO has failed. But you can quite clearly see that there's a panic in Ireland and throughout NATO circles. There's a major panic about, is NATO going to be able to survive? Is Europe going to be able to make the contributions that it needs to make for NATO to be able to retain the position that it has now? I know you can hear that little thing ringing in your ear, can you, Roddy?
Yes, I do indeed. But
it's like a refreshing sound or something, a refresh sound on a computer. Yeah.
I think it's my good lady wife who's sitting opposite me. I think it's her that's making that piggy noise. I'm not sure. Now, where was I? You've thrown me there, mate. I was going, oh yeah.
So you're asking me about NATO.
Do you see the likelihood of it? It was started by Tony Blair, the idea, I think, originally, which is a European army.
Well, PESCO.
Withdrawing completely.
Yeah, well, PESCO was that idea, which is still in existence, and PESCO was the concept of a European army that would work in tandem with NATO. Basically, it was into my mind going to be the European arm of NATO as a collective. That's what it was going to be. PESCO, by separating it by a degree from NATO, it looked a little bit more enticing, possibly, to some Irish people and some other people in other countries who traditionally have remained neutral in matters of warfare and things like that. So, I see NATO will fundamentally change in some way. It's not going to have the warlike tendencies over the next 4 years. But remember, if Trump gets voted out in 4 years, are we back to square one with the nuts?
Yeah, could be. But that was one of the things I was going to say, that, will the EU survive this?
That's the EU is in a very precarious position at the moment from the point of view of the political movements that are growing in each country. And we can see that the response to that has been to shut down information and to shut down the media that are seeking alternatives in Europe. So we can see in Germany, for instance, there's been a lot of arrests, interrogations of people who are against what Israel is doing in Palestine. There have also been arrest warrants issued for journalists who've been honestly reporting about the Ukraine war in Germany. We also know that in the UK, journalists are coming under increasing pressure. So there is a pushback against this new popular or populist, if you want to use that word, populist as the status quo like to describe them. I don't know what's so insulting about being called a populist. To me, that's democracy. I actually, just out of interest, I came across the counter definitions of populist. To our mind, a populist is someone who represents the public opinion. To the collective academia in the West, a populist is someone who identifies a minority as a problem to get elected, basically. So that's the two definitions. I prefer the first definition. A populist is someone who's democratic and is advocating for the will of the people, whatever that will may be. There is a big pushback against these new political movements. There's attempts to, like in Germany, there's been open public discussion about banning the AfD, about that if they do ever get elected, that they won't be allowed to take government. We saw that happening in Romania. We saw attempts at that in Georgia. So there is a totalitarian backlash, and Hegsart from the US and also Vice President Vance have spoken on this issue of the development of totalitarianism within the EU, and it's quite clear in Britain too. It was on so many issues. People have been visited by the police for their social media posts, so that pushback is there. But ultimately, it's not going to work. But if they keep on pushing back, if they keep on trying to turn Europe and Britain into martial law states where you're not allowed to have an opinion. I'll give you an example. Journal.ie in Ireland used to be just a media thing, and it used to be critical of the government. They suddenly got funding to become fact checkers. Last week, I shared a post about the chair of the Munich conference when he welled up and he started to almost cry a little bit because of this division between America and Europe now. And he didn't throw himself on the ground wailing with tears, but he did. You could see him welling up, and so I put this up that as a part of a bigger story. That the chair of the Munich conference started to cry. I was not fact-checked on that. I was context-checked and given a warning. Not fact-checked, context-checked. And then it introduced the context. No, sorry, that one there was a fact-check and said, no, he did not start crying. Well, it's quite obvious he did. He didn't. But there was another thing about Elon Musk, something this week I was context-checked on. To say, oh yeah, it was about... It's about something to do with negotiations between the US and Russia. And I put in that Donald Trump said X, Y, and Z. And they threw in this context, which had nothing to do with it whatsoever. So what I've started to do on journal.ie stories now, I have started to context check them. And I'll write a whole thing just the way they write it. And I'll context check everything that they put up now. And I would like other people who are watching here to context and to fact check the fact checkers.
Bad idea.
My overall point is that this pushback, this totalitarian pushback that's happening, that's been funded by the current leadership of the EU, to my mind, that is going to formulate possibly violence in some countries in the EU as it hardens and it solidifies in its intensity, this totalitarianism.
Yeah, but I thought, Vance, I heard Vance's speech on the Hesketh, and I thought they're a wee bit hypocritical, talking about the First Amendment and how you should be able to say freedom of speech and it's, shared values. Trump said any student who demonstrates in favour of Palestine will get kicked, they'll demand their student loan paid immediately, they'll be kicked out of university. If they're a foreign student, they'll be expelled. So they're a wee bit hypocritical.
Oh, I agree.
To tell anyone else about freedom of speech when they're quite like that.
I agree, Billy, I agree, yeah.
But on that, we're talking about the European army and everything else, because what also Trump has done, cutting the legs away from his allies, he said, you can sit and post, you can send in their troops, the Brits, the French, whoever they like, but there's no Article 5. We aren't coming to help you if you end up fighting the Russians. Now, if that doesn't waken up the Atlanticists, I don't know what will.
Yeah. There is a train of thought among some of the EU leadership nuts that our alliances are so historical and our commitments to each other are so based in history that if we get involved in a war in Ukraine, the Americans will come in our side eventually. I think that's the attitude that's there. And a lot of people just don't fully get the fundamental changes in terms of Europe and Ukraine that have occurred since Trump's inauguration. I think some of them, from a strategic point of view, are probably going to be sitting saying, we'll just wait this 4 years out and we'll try to get back to plan A again. But I've just got a feeling that's not going to work for them. I think events are going to work a lot faster than that. But don't be surprised to see some significant, serious event that disables Trump in some way. And when I say disables, I don't mean physically necessarily, but disables his ability to move in any direction. I'm sure there's elements out there that have planned to bomb him. I've looked at plans about bombing him, doing this. You look at the extremities of some of these Ukrainian supporters, and they are such extremists, they will go to any length, I think.
But he also, as you've probably heard recently, he's left word and spoken about it again, as you say, no filter, that if the Iranians kill him, that they'll have to be bombed back to the Middle Ages, wiped off the face of the earth.
That's
And
like asking Israel to shoot him.
I mean, Betty Netanyahu must have been sitting there going,
Yippee, yippee.
interesting.
Yeah.
So you know, you better watch the Israelis don't take him out and put some poor Iranians left holding a gun going, what, you want where? What?
yeah. But that is the danger of it as well, you know, and the manipulation you and I have seen, and anybody with a brain has seen the vulgar, atrocious manipulation of facts in Palestine, as an example. Beheaded babies that never existed, mass rape.
There you go. So this actually came out, Scott Ritter, the Marine, the respected weapons inspector. So the family of the two babies the Israeli government say were strangled to death by Palestinians has called the government narrative a lie and demanded that the government, that is the Israeli government, stay away from the funeral of the babies. The Israeli government is incapable of telling the truth about anything.
Yeah.
Just to back up what you're about to say.
And so in terms of any assassination attempt into the future on Trump, I have no doubt the Israelis will present that as something to do with Iran and Hamas, you know.
Yeah.
But and we have to be able to. I think Donald Trump, I remember seeing an interview with Donald Trump in which he outright said he knows that Netanyahu is a down-out liar and everything, that he can't be trusted. I remember seeing an interview with Trump where he said he knows that. So he's aware that most stuff that comes from Zionist elements are propaganda, atrocity propaganda. But on the other hand, he has to play it clever because he does know as well that the Zionist lobby controls every single politician in the United States, owns them, blackmails them, bribes them, owns them in one way or another. And he has to play ball with that. On top, I'm not saying that he's in any way sympathetic to the Palestinians, but that's a consideration that he has to take in every time he addresses anything to do with Palestine.
Yeah, it's a mess. I've got a few programs of that, and we'll no doubt have a few more. This war, what I didn't ask you right at the beginning, which I usually do, is do you have an update on the latest going on in the actual trenches up in the front lines?
Yeah, I'm just looking at it again over the last few days. It's just progress on the part of the Russians. You see regular reports of incidents of mass surrenders on the parts of Ukrainian troops. I think that has increased dramatically since Trump was inaugurated and has made the public statements that he's made. A lot of Ukrainians didn't want to go to the front lines anyway, but now they're thinking, if I can stay alive for the next few weeks, and if that means running away for a few weeks, if I can stay alive until a peace deal is done. Since we last spoke, we know that there was a drone attack on the Chernobyl nuclear plant. You know, the Ukrainians have been trying to create a war zone out of Zaporizhia, but we saw an attack on Chernobyl itself. Again, trying to escalate things, trying to create crisis where they can. You mentioned yourself that Kursk region, the Russian Kursk region, is nearly cleared of Ukrainians. The reports that I've been reading is that it's progress along the front lines, though I have read a number of reports that the Russians have reduced the risks that they're taking in certain areas on the battlefield since Trump was inaugurated. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. We're not on the ground to see it ourselves. But that there has been a reduction in risk-taking, possibly to save Russian personnel at a time when peace is so near. Can't validate that. Most of the stuff on the front lines we can't validate, other than the big picture that the Russians continue to advance, not at the level of September, October, November, but they are still advancing, and that there's still the game is in their hand, and there's no sight of a Ukrainian resurgence. There was talk only a few weeks ago of another Ukrainian counteroffensive up near north. There was some movements, but it was very, very small. In fact, some Russian commentators were thinking that this might be a dupe and the real offensive might be coming tomorrow or the next day. It never came. So it's almost like Hitler in his bunker, Zelensky, playing with non-existent army formations, playing with non-existent troops, just shouting at everybody, move forward, don't fall back. He is Hitler in the bunker at the moment, as far as I can see.
Yeah. I'm no military expert myself, but I have followed this closely and listening to some of the experts. Going back a year or more, they mentioned Chasiv Yar, which is a fairly medium-sized city in the Donbass, as a critical logistical place. It's high up, and you can see literally for a mile after. So there's no, if the Ukrainians lose that position, they've got nowhere to really
The whole
fall
region.
back to. They're wide open, and when they try to escape, it could be appalling. But the talk is that it's going down literally street by street, but that's almost entirely now in Russian hands, and that's a vital place to have taken, isn't it?
Yeah, we were talking about this 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And about 6 months ago, the Russians were coming close to the central area of parts of Chasiv Yar. It is, by all reports, a very important strategic position for the entire region. It is a mound of earth that overviews the entire region. Strategically, from a military point of view, extremely hard to take, especially in street-to-street battles when you get to that point. But you need to get to the place first. You need to advance uphill with all of your machinery. It's very weather-orientated as well. I think in Ukraine at the moment, you still have some hard ground there. But coming into spring now, when the ground starts to soften off a bit, all of those offensives, all of those movement forwards will be slowed down a bit as well. But the fall of Chasiv Yar, we've been talking about it. I remember talking about Chasiv Yar a year and a half ago. And we kind of, because normally when we're looking at wars, it's from a historical point of view. And on this page, we read this happened. And then minutes later, this happened on the next page. When in reality, sometimes it can take a year, 2 years to make a small enough advancement in terms of scale because of the difficulties in terrain, difficulties with weather, all those kind of things. But Chasiv Yar does look like it's near falling to the Russians as well. Just waiting to see it happen. My concern always, more than anything else, has been the death of the flower of youth of Ukraine and of Russia. But the mass majority of casualties and deaths, as far as I'm aware, has been on the Ukrainian side. And we can talk about all of these things and taking places and everything else. To my mind, I would love to waken up in the morning to hear there's a deal. There's a deal. You don't have to have programs talking about military advance or defense or anything anymore. There's a deal.
Yeah, I would like to. Peace, I've been saying it, as you have,
Yeah.
since February 22, immediate ceasefire, negotiated settlement. And it's getting closer. And from my point of view, and I think especially for the Ukrainian people, it can't come soon enough when the losses are such. I mean, as I say, I've heard reports of 1 million dead and wounded in the Ukrainian side. I mean, I don't know, but that's figures getting bandied about quite a lot by people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, etc. Those losses are huge, Ray Finbar.
When you look at the amount of people that have left Ukraine, the scores of millions of people that
7 million,
led Ukraine, and then you look at the loss and the internal loss, because these are these people have been identified to go to war because of their capabilities, their age, their physical well-being, their physical health, things like that. That's what has been sent to the front. Is Ukraine, from a male point of view in particular, is Ukraine now going to be populated by 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds? Not even 19 and 20, because I think some of them, but 18-year-olds. Is that who's going to lead Ukraine into its future? And the women of Ukraine. That's who's left there, because so many people have left. I've spoken to Ukrainian refugees in Ireland, and they have no intention of going home. Why would they want to go home to a place that has an energy system that's destroyed, that's still in political disarray, that vast regions of it are controlled by essentially Nazi-orientated militias, that has no economic prospects? Why would you want to go home to? Why would you want to bring your children back to that? So a lot of Ukrainians are not going home, and they're going to refuse to go home, no matter how much we cut their benefits, no matter how much we do anything else. And although from an Irish domestic financial point of view, etc., I would like to see them all going home in a way, to be honest with you. I empathize with them, and I understand their position of not wanting to go home. So Ukraine is a country that has been decimated by a disease called American exceptionalism over the last 4 years in particular. And it is a leper. And I've got a feeling that regular people won't want to touch it. The big companies will want to touch it. The rebuilding costs will be amazing. The mineral wealth that's left in Ukrainian hands, the agricultural wealth that's left, that will be used to pay for the rebuilding costs. And the rebuilding costs will all be big Western companies. That's what ultimately an aspect of this is about. There's always money making in there. You look at the rebuilding of Iraq after the Iraq, and there was a lot less damage there, but the rebuilding of the bridges, and the American companies that were not only involved in that, but charged 50, 60 times the price of the rebuild of the building and charged it to the Iraqi government and took the money in oil. So that's what Ukraine is about to face now. So it's decimated. It's not a country. I wouldn't be surprised to see it breaking up. I wouldn't be surprised to see parts of Ukraine once more becoming parts of Romania and Poland. It just wouldn't surprise me.
And I mean, I've said, the EU started off as the common market, and it was one of the main functions of it was to stop wars between the main European powers, and it worked by trading, by finding common ground called the common market. That we did it, and one of the things about the EU was we're proud of that it was a non-military, non-aggressive, a decent, honest broker that the world could call upon. And then there was von der Leyen. The EU has now become actually despised because of its militarism.
Not only its militarism, the low quality of its leadership, the pettiness of its leadership, the continued colonial attitude of its leadership, even amongst people who perceive themselves to be postmodern in terms of colonialism. When you listen to the language and the words that they use, they're still colonialists, So the EU has been able to put on a mask of diplomacy, a mask of conservative consideration, but in reality, go right back to the EU, individual states' colonial past. They were the nastiest of the nastiest. Look what the Belgians did in the Congo. Look what Europeans did all around the world. Look what the British did in Australia, digging pits and putting Aborigines in them up to their necks and then seeing who could kick their heads off while they're still alive. So we like to put this, classical Greek educated Europe, and that we have civilization back to the Greek times, and all bullshit. Pardon for the language. Even to this day, I see it now that it's showing itself for what it really is, and it's getting worse. So it's in its desperation, it's actually turning into an effigy of what it claims to be against. It's becoming totalitarian, militaristic, pro-war, greedy, and most of all, completely irrational.
Yeah, and they're completely detached from the people who sent them there.
Yeah. I just remember as well, you were talking about this idea, to do trade and to do business, and that's the way we sort our problems. Well, wasn't that the great American promise? To the American people.
Till they get competition, and then they change their mind.
And then suddenly they change their mind. So look at China. China played the ball in the global economy, and really, really did well. For a time, we could point at them and laugh at them and say, oh, they can create. They have to steal our stuff. They can create. When they start creating, we go into a panic and we say that they're the enemy that wants to take over the world. The bottom line is, there was a time that I actually rejected and balked at the idea of trade and business being a key element of global peace. Now, as a mature adult, I fully get it. And that's why, for instance, BRICS was formed. Because the Americans were using the dominance of the dollar to be able to displace economic growth on the part of countries. So BRICS is formed. You hear Donald Trump making threats, 100% tariffs to anybody who tries to challenge the US dollar. The reason the US dollar was being challenged was because it was weaponized. So everything scales up. Go into the US itself. Imagine you trying to do good business in the US. You start having a success, and the bigger companies try to buy you out. If you're not willing to sell, they try to do you in. Now expand that onto a global level. That's the Americans. What they did to their own people, there was a lot of agricultural opposition to the development of the train networks in the US in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was movies made about it, great cowboy movies made about it. There was a lot of support. A lot of farmers thought it would get their produce out to the cities as well. But there was a lot of opposition there. What happened in those movies? They were bully-boyed into accepting the railway. That's what America does right around the world. They bully-boy you into accepting the American train.
Yeah, and actually, folks, if you go back to my blog site, barheadboy.com, you will find an article on that last week, Carrots and Sticks, I called it. And said the Americans use the sticks, and the Europeans use the sticks, and the Chinese and the Russians are using carrots. Guess who's more popular in the world?
Or what we call them in Ireland, snowman noses.
There you go. There you go, snowman's noses, absolutely. Finbar, clock's beating us again as always. It's as always as true. It's been a joy to speak to you. I could sit here for the rest of the day. But to you and to everyone watching and yours, please take care till we see you again.
And one last thing, Roddy. As a part of the independence movement in Scotland, I think neutrality should be key to the Scottish independence movement, just like it's key to our sense of sovereignty in Ireland. I
agree 100%. Peace before war, bears before bombs.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye, guys.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.